The silence was deafening in St. Peter's Square that somber morning. Thousands stood motionless as the funeral procession for Pope Francis slowly made its way toward the basilica. Among the Swiss guards standing at attention was 26-year-old Marco Vincenzo, positioned prominently near the entrance. 5 years of flawless service. Yet in this crucial moment, the unthinkable happened. As the casket passed, his ceremonial halberd slipped from his grasp. Clattering loudly against the marble floor, the metallic echo reverberated throughout the square as horrified gasps rippled through the crowd. In that moment of humiliation, with cameras capturing his failure and broadcasting it worldwide, Marco made a decision that would change everything. Before we continue, if you enjoy stories of profound human moments and unexpected courage, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. Marco Vincenzo had dreamed of joining the Swiss Guard since he was a small boy growing up in the mountain village of Poschiavo, Switzerland. His grandfather had served in the Guard during the pontificate of Pope John XXII, and the stories he told around the fireplace had kindled a flame in young Marco's heart that never dimmed. The colorful Renaissance uniforms, the solemn oath to protect the Holy Father with one's life. These were not mere traditions to Marco, but his destiny. The Swiss Guard is not just an honor, his grandfather would tell him. It is a sacred duty passed down through centuries. Since 1506, we have stood as the guardians of the papacy. Remember, Marco, the uniform does not make the guard. It is the heart beneath it. When Marco was finally accepted into the elite corps at 21, after rigorous military training and scrutiny of his Catholic faith and character, his grandfather had wept with pride. "You carry our family's honor now," he had said, pressing a small silver crucifix into Marco's palm. "Keep this close, and let it remind you of why you serve." For 5 years, Marco had been exemplary. He mastered the complex ceremonial protocols, the ancient halberding techniques, and earned the respect of his commanding officers. Pope Francis himself had once paused to speak with him during a private audience, commenting on the young guard's attentiveness. "You have watchful eyes," the Pope had said with a gentle smile. "But remember to watch with your heart as well as your eyes." Those words had stayed with Marco, though he wasn't entirely sure what the Holy Father had meant, until today. The morning of the funeral had begun like any other significant Vatican ceremony, with meticulous preparation. The Swiss Guard had been drilling for weeks, anticipating this somber day that they knew would eventually come. Though Pope Francis, beloved for his humility and compassion, had seemed eternal to many. At 89 years old, his passing had come peacefully in his sleep after a brief illness. Yet the world mourned as if caught unprepared. Marco had risen before dawn, saying his prayers with particular fervor. He polished his armor until it gleamed, straightened the plumed helmet with its distinctive red feather, and carefully checked his ceremonial halberd. This ancient weapon, a combination of axe and spear atop a 6-foot pole, wasn't merely decorative. The Swiss Guard trained extensively in its use, honoring the tradition of their predecessors who had wielded similar weapons in the sack of Rome in 1527, when 147 guards died protecting Pope Clement VII. As he prepared, Marco thought of his grandfather, who had passed away just 2 months earlier. "I will make you proud today," he whispered, touching the silver crucifix he now wore on a chain beneath his uniform. He hadn't been able to return home for the funeral due to his duties, and the guilt of that absence still weighed heavily on him. The funeral mass itself had been profound. Cardinals from around the world, heads of state, religious leaders of various faiths, all gathered to honor a man who had pushed the church toward greater humility and service to the poor. The Swiss Guard stood at attention throughout, positioned strategically around St. Peter's Basilica, their colorful uniforms a stark contrast to the solemnity of the occasion. After the Mass concluded, the casket was to be carried in procession through St. Peter's Square before its final journey to the crypts beneath the basilica. This was when Marco took up his position near the great doors, standing rigid as marble, his halberd held perfectly vertical. The procession began with the slow, haunting chant of the Miserere. Cardinals walked ahead of the casket, which was carried by 12 pallbearers. Marco focused on maintaining perfect composure, though inside, Emotions churned. He had genuinely loved this pope, who had always acknowledged the guards not as mere ceremonial fixtures, but as young men far from home with hopes and fears of their own. As the casket approached Marco's position, a sudden, overwhelming grief seized him, grief not just for the pope, but for his grandfather, whose funeral he had missed. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as the weight of the halberd shifted. He tried to compensate but overcorrected. The heavy ceremonial weapon slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to Marco as loud as thunder. Time seemed to stop. In the Swiss Guard's 500-year history, such a breach of protocol during a papal funeral was unprecedented. Marco felt the eyes of the world upon him, the shocked stares of his fellow guards, the pitying glances of the clergy, the cold lenses of cameras capturing his disgrace to broadcast globally. His commanding officer, Captain Bergman, a stern man known for his rigid adherence to protocol, fixed him with a gaze that promised severe consequences. In that moment of humiliation, something broke inside Marco, not his discipline or his pride, but the dam holding back his genuine emotion. Pope Francis had always emphasized authentic humanity over rigid formality. He had been a pope who washed the feet of prisoners, who embraced the disfigured, who told his priests to be shepherds with the smell of sheep. What happened next occurred in the span of mere seconds, though it would be analyzed and replayed for weeks afterward. Instead of immediately retrieving his fallen weapon as protocol demanded, Marco did something unprecedented. He stepped forward from his position, approached the papal casket, and knelt beside it. Then, in a clear voice that carried across the hushed square, he began to pray not in Latin or Italian, but in his native Swiss-German dialect. "Holy Father," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "forgive me for this failure in my duty, but more than that, I thank you for showing us that our humanity matters more than our perfection. I could not bid farewell to my grandfather, but today I say goodbye to you, who taught us that mercy trumps protocol. May God embrace you as you embraced the least among us." The silence that followed was absolute. Captain Bergman took a half-step forward, clearly intending to remove Marco from the scene, but paused when Cardinal Rossetti, the Camerlengo who had been Pope Francis's closest confidant, raised a subtle hand to stop him. Then Marco reached beneath his collar and removed the silver crucifix his grandfather had given him. With reverent hands, he placed it atop the papal casket. "A guardian's heart," he whispered, echoing his grandfather's words, "to watch over you in eternity as you watched over us in life." As Marco rose and stepped back, retrieving his fallen halberd, the cardinal nearest the casket, an elderly Italian who had worked alongside Pope Francis for decades, was openly weeping. So too were many in the crowd, moved by this unscripted moment of raw humanity amidst the rigid ceremony. What followed that evening would become legend within the walls of Vatican City. Marco reported to Captain Bergman's office, fully expecting to be dismissed from the guard in disgrace. Instead, he found not only his commander but Cardinal Rossetti waiting for him. "Guard Vincenzo," the captain began formally, his face unreadable. "Your actions today represented a serious breach of protocol." Marco stood at attention, eyes forward. "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility and any consequences deemed appropriate." The captain and cardinal exchanged glances. Then, unexpectedly, the cardinal spoke. "Young man, I knew Pope Francis perhaps better than anyone. For 10 years I was his secretary, confidant, and friend. Do you know what he often said about the church's ceremonies?" Marco shook his head slightly. "He said they exist to elevate the spirit, not to imprison it. That when ritual becomes more important than the human heart, we have lost our way." The cardinal approached Marco and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Today you dropped your weapon. Then you showed everyone why Pope Francis chose misericordiae, mercy, as the theme of his pontificate." Captain Bergman cleared his throat. "The breach of protocol remains a serious matter," he said, though his tone had softened slightly. "However, given the extraordinary circumstances and the cardinal's intervention, you will not be dismissed from service." Relief flooded through Marco. But the cardinal wasn't finished. "There is more," he said. "When we prepared Pope Francis for burial, we found this note in his cassock pocket. It was written 3 days before his death." He handed Marco a small folded paper. With trembling fingers, Marco opened it. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "Remember, the Lord does not remove our crosses. He helps us carry them with love. Our failures are the cracks through which his light enters." Marco looked up, confused. "I don't understand, Your Eminence. Was this meant for me?" The cardinal smiled gently. "It was meant for whoever needed it most. Today, that appears to be you." He paused thoughtfully. "There is something else. The crucifix you placed on the Holy Father's casket." "My grandfather's," Marco said quickly. "I'm sorry for the impropriety. If it could be returned." "It will not be returned," the cardinal said firmly. Then his expression softened. "Because Pope Francis will be buried with it tomorrow." Marco's eyes widened. "But, Your Eminence, the Pope once told me that the most precious gifts are those given at great personal cost. Your grandfather's crucifix, given in a moment of grief and love, is precisely such a gift." The cardinal reached into his pocket. "However, he would not wish you to be without protection." He pressed something into Marco's palm. A simple wooden rosary with worn beads. This belonged to Pope Francis. He carried it since his days as a young priest in Buenos Aires. Now it belongs to you. Marco stared at the humble rosary, overwhelmed. "I don't deserve this honor. None of us deserves grace," the cardinal replied. "That is why it is grace." As Marco left the office, his fellow Swiss guards were waiting outside. He expected recrimination, perhaps even mockery. Instead, Stefan, his closest friend among them, stepped forward and embraced him. "We saw a true guardian today," Stefan said quietly. "Not someone who never drops his weapon, but someone who knows what to do after he falls." In the days that followed, Marco's moment at the funeral became something of a global phenomenon. Video clips spread across social media. News programs analyzed the breach of protocol and the emotional aftermath. Some Vatican traditionalists criticized the departure from ceremony, but they were vastly outnumbered by those who saw in Marco's actions an embodiment of Pope Francis's emphasis on compassion over rigidity. Letters poured in from around the world, from Catholics and non-Catholics alike, commending the young guard for his humanity. Many wrote that the moment had moved them to tears, that it reminded them of what religion at its best could be. Not perfect adherence to rules, but perfect love expressed imperfectly. 1 month after the funeral, Marco received permission to return briefly to Poschiavo to visit his grandmother. As he entered the small mountain village wearing civilian clothes, he was surprised to find many villagers waiting to greet him. News of his actions had reached even this remote corner of Switzerland, and he was welcomed not as someone who had failed in his duty, but as someone who had fulfilled a deeper one. His grandmother embraced him tearfully. "Your grandfather always said you had a guardian's heart," she told him. "Now the world knows it too." That evening, as snow began to fall outside the small chalet, Marco sat with his grandmother by the fire, the Pope's rosary in his hands. "I still feel the shame of dropping the halberd," he admitted. "Years of training, and I failed at the most important moment." His grandmother took his hand in hers, her eyes wise with years. "Marco, do you know why the Swiss Guard has endured for over 5 centuries when other ceremonial guards have faded into history?" He shook his head. "Because they guard not just with weapons, but with faith. Not just with protocol, but with heart." She touched the wooden rosary beads. "Your grandfather would tell you that sometimes God allows us to drop our weapons so we can extend our hands." When Marco returned to the Vatican, he found his duties subtly changed. Captain Bergman, perhaps recognizing something valuable in the young guard, assigned him to assist with pilgrim groups, particularly those bringing sick children to receive papal blessings. His warmth and genuine faith made him especially effective in preparing these visitors for their brief but meaningful encounters with the new pope, who had taken the name Innocent XIV. The new pontiff, a Brazilian cardinal who had been a close ally of Francis, seemed to share his predecessor's appreciation for authenticity over ceremony. During one private audience, He paused as he passed Marco standing at attention. "Ah, Guard Vincenzo," he said warmly. "Pope Francis often said we should not hide our wounds, for they are where the light enters. You showed the world that truth." He touched the wooden rosary now wrapped around Marco's wrist beneath his colorful uniform sleeve. "Continue to guard with your heart as well as your hands." 6 months after the funeral, Cardinal Rossetti invited Marco to his office. "I have something to show you," he said, leading Marco not to a meeting room but to a small side chapel rarely visited by tourists. There, in a simple glass display case, was Marco's grandfather's silver crucifix. Beside it, a small plaque read, "Donated by Swiss Guard Marco Vincenzo in an act of devotion that reminded the world that mercy and love transcend perfect protocol." Placed initially on Pope Francis's casket, now preserved as a testament that our humanity is our greatest gift to God. Marco stared at the display, speechless. "Your crucifix was indeed buried with Pope Francis," the cardinal explained. "But first, we had a replica made, this one, to preserve the moment for future generations. The Holy Father's final ceremonies may fade from memory, but your act of human devotion will inspire those who come after us." That evening, as sunset bathed St. Peter's Square in golden light, Marco stood at his post, the weight of the halberd familiar in his hands. Tourists passed by, some recognizing him and pointing discreetly, but Marco's attention was drawn to a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, staring up at him with wonder. "Were you afraid?" the boy asked suddenly in heavily accented English. "When you dropped your spear thing?" Marco glanced around, ensuring he wasn't neglecting his duties by responding. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I was very afraid." The boy nodded solemnly. "My papa says brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing what's right even when you are scared." "Your papa is very wise," Marco replied with a smile. "He also cried when he saw you on TV," the boy added matter-of-factly. "He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Is not even Catholic." As the boy ran back to his waiting parents, Marco felt a profound peace settle over him. The silver crucifix might rest with Pope Francis in the crypts beneath the basilica, but its meaning lived on in the replica displayed nearby, in the stories people told, and in Marco's own heart. In that moment, he understood more deeply what Pope Francis had meant about watching with the heart. It wasn't about never failing or never dropping one's weapon. It was about what you chose to do after the fall. It was about recognizing that sometimes the greatest strength comes in our moments of greatest vulnerability. The Swiss Guard had protected popes for over 500 years with their halberds and swords. But on that funeral day, one young guard had protected something perhaps even more precious, the message of mercy and authentic humanity that had defined Pope Francis's papacy. As the evening prayer bells began to toll across the eternal city, Marco stood tall at his post, halberd perfectly vertical, but beneath his ceremonial uniform, against his skin, the wooden rosary beads of a humble pope reminded him that while protocols might govern actions, only love transforms the world, and sometimes that transformation begins with a single moment of human frailty, a dropped weapon, a tearful prayer, and the courage to show the world that even those sworn to perfect discipline remain perfectly human. Years later, when tourists would visit the Vatican museums, many would pause longest at a small, easily overlooked display, a simple silver crucifix with a modest explanation of its significance. Tour guides would tell the story of the Swiss guard who dropped his weapon and, in picking it up again, reminded the world of Pope Francis's essential message, that our wounds and failures need not define us, but can become the very channels through which grace enters the world. In the barracks of the Swiss Guard, new recruits would hear the story during their training, not as a warning against breaking protocol, but as a reminder of what their ceremonial role truly protected. "We guard not just the Pope," their instructors would tell them, "but the very heart of the faith he represents." And in a mountain village in Switzerland, an elderly woman would show visitors a wooden rosary once held by a pope, and tell them how her grandson had taught the world that sometimes the most perfect service comes through imperfect moments embraced with perfect love. For Marco Vincenzo, the day he dropped his halberd would always remain both the most humiliating and the most transcendent moment of his life. the day he failed in his duty yet fulfilled his purpose. A reminder that sometimes we must let go of our weapons to extend our hands, let go of our pride to embrace our humanity, and let go of our fear to make room for love. In the end, it wasn't a dropped weapon that people remembered, but what came after: the kneeling guard, the heartfelt prayer, the silver crucifix given in love. A moment of human frailty transformed by courage and faith into a testament that would outlive all those who witnessed it. And perhaps that was Pope Francis's final gift to the world: the understanding that our most powerful witnesses come not from our strength and perfection, but from how we rise after we fall, how we love despite our fear, and how we transform our deepest wounds into channels of extraordinary grace.